Hello. So this is me reading one of my favorite books that we read in class often. You can see it's quite used book. This book is called Sideways Stories from Wayside School, and I'll be posting some videos of me reading various chapters. We'll of course start with chapter 1. Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears, and she was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th floor. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into an apple." Mrs. Gorf did not like children, but she loved apples. Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count, but he knew if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first the right, then the left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple just for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help his friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first the right, then the left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed, and she put the 3 apples on her desk. Stefan started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was so scared. "I do not allow crying in my classroom," said Mrs. Gorf, and she wiggled her ears, first the right, then the left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stefan into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, Stefan, they couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them there on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed, "Shoo!" during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "Bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first the right, then the left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Marissa tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she had reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear began to wiggle. Marissa had opened the door and had one foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue and turned Marissa into an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on the desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. As Mrs. Gorf was turning around, she tripped. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stefan, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrace, Marissa, and the 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in to the classroom. He had missed the children at recess, and he had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came to investigate. He saw 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. And there I need to pause for a second. This book was written in the United States, about a school in the United States. And a while ago, when I was little, if you liked your teacher, you brought them an apple. So a teacher that had a whole bunch of apples was a good teacher. "I must be wrong," he thought. "She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples." And he walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I won't have to teach any more. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bobbed Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed, and Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor, and with little apples jumping all over her. Stop, she yelled, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue and wiggled her ears, this time first the left one and then the right one, and turned the apples back into children. All right, said Marissa. Let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. And she wiggled her ears, first the right, then the left, stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. And even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Oh boy, I'm hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. And he picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf. He shined it on his shirt and he ate it. End of chapter 1. I hope you enjoyed it, and there'll be others.